Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. I'm Bert Fabian, and I'm working as a senior transport specialist at the Asian Development Bank under the Emerging Areas in the Transport Sector Office. I Today's webinar is quite interesting. We have Dr. Mubeen Ahmad, and he will talk about geofencing for urban mobility, advancing safety, sustainability, and connectivity, and also how this relates to electric mobility. But we will hear more about that later. This webinar, as many of you have been following it or participating in the events, you know that this is organized under the umbrella of the Electric Mobility Support and Investment Platform for Asia Pacific, which aims to build this capacity and support in scaling up of financing for e-mobility initiatives. It's operated by the Asian Development Bank, co-implemented by UNEP and co-financed by the Global Environment Facility. We are also joined today by one of our colleagues from the Integrated Transport Planning, the firm who is helping us in undertaking or setting up this support and investment platform. I will be taking over the role as the ADB focal point for the electric mobility platform. Many of you have known me for quite some time in my time with UNEP, but also even before that, looking at various issues on electric mobility. Over the last few months or years, you've seen many projects on electric mobility. It's no longer flavor of the month. It's here to stay. And from private vehicles, public transportation, paratransit, micro mobility, electric mobility is playing a role. So hopefully over the next series of the webinar and activities of the support and investment platform, we will be able to do more. Now, if you would like to join this e-mobility community under the platform, we have the QR code. I believe my colleagues will share this in a few. Please sign up and you can stay up to date on the platform's activities, but also leave your assessment and so to help us improve the activities, the webinars, but also the activities of the support and investment platform. And then finally, we have been conducting this webinar series for some time with the help of colleagues from ITP. We will have a short interval or maybe a bit like 2 weeks interval this time. And the next uh, e-mobility webinar will be focusing also on the maritime sector. On March 5, 2025, we will have Justin Cross, who will talk about the role of e-mobility in decarbonizing the maritime sector. And as such, I would like to hand over to Adele Samuels, our colleague from ITP. Please, Adele, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bert. Um, Before introducing today's speaker, just a couple of words with regards to the webinar house rules. Um, we would like a smooth webinar session, so can you please ensure that all your microphones will be muted unless you are invited to speak? Um, At the end of today's session, there will be time for questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to present us with any questions that you may have. And this can be done during the presentation as well. Um, Please note that the webinar session will be recorded and it will be shared online. Now, let me introduce you to today's speaker. Professor Mubeen Ahmad is our speaker for today. He is a principal at MNA Design International and a lecturer and research fellow at the University of Queensland. Professor Mubeen has nearly 2 decades of experience in sustainable and urban development. He has led 25 transformative projects globally, delivering innovative, resilient, and sustainable solutions through collaborations with governments, organizations, private stakeholders across Asia Pacific, South Asia, and the Americas. Without further ado, let me hand over to Professor Mubeen for his presentation. As mentioned earlier, we do have time for Q&A at the end of the session, so please post any questions you may have already during the presentation. Professor Mubeen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm absolutely very thrilled and to be here and have this opportunity to be part of this group and have a very fruitful discussion with you on geofencing. Thanks to ADB and ITP for putting this webinar together. I'd like to begin by telling a story about Brisbane. And a few years ago, Brisbane has sort of undergone a major transformation. It's a city in Australia that has seen for the in firsthand, the evolution of urban mobility taking place in a much more rapid manner. And not too long ago, Brisbane took a very bold step by launching an e-mobility strategy. And that led that city to become one of the Australian's first cities to formally integrate shared micromobility into its transport network. And I believe that it's that decision that sort of set the foundation for what would become a significant shift in how people move through this city. And as you know, even in your cities, you might have noticed that there are e-scooters and e-bikes. They're now making their way into the market, and they do provide a substantial and a, a sustainable alternative to cars, especially for shorter trips. So, but with any transformation of such kind, there's a rapid adoption of challenges that come along with it. And if you just rewind back a few years, and if you're just walking in Brisbane for, back in 2018, for instance, it was that CBD was regarded as a very busy pedestrian precinct, and that was um, often described as a chaotic place to be. There were e-scooters weaving through the crowds quite unpredictably in certain moments, and they were going at unsafe speeds. Footpaths were sort of quite littered with a lot of these e-bikes and devices sort of parked haphazardly. Basically, it was a fast-moving space, and much of it was unregulated. And while these mobility devices opened up new opportunities for transport, but they also raised a lot of the concerns about safety. And that became a big pressing concern for the city. But fast forward to today, and that entire landscape has changed and become a major transformation zone. And that's, I believe, thanks to a strategic urban planning and an integration of geofencing technology. That space and many spaces around that city now operate a lot more smoothly, and they work a lot more safely for a lot of the pedestrians. But this sort of change didn't just happen overnight. And we now have a system in place where riders would experience changes in their vehicles or devices as they go through a lot of these places. We also have a system in place that would prevent a lot of the conflicts that might have traditionally emerged because of these sensitive locations. And now we also have a system where people can have greater access to smarter and more accessible spaces. And that, I believe, is a result of the city's more proactive approach to urban mobility because it sort of blended policy innovation with technological driven solutions. And at the same time, I also believe that Brisbane's story is not unique. I mean, there are many cities around the world where cities are now realizing that moving people is not just only about moving them from point A to point B. In fact, we can now testify to the fact that mobility across all urban centers, they are evolving. And that's true not just only in Brisbane, but almost around the world. And that reason itself has led to a lot of discussion in academic circles, in government-led tier levels about how mobility is really at the heart of how cities function, because cities, as they grow, they pretty much influence everything around them. They influence how we live in those cities. They influence how we drive the economic progress. And therefore, for these reasons, no matter where we live or work, transportation is at the core of it all. And that's what brings us to this topic, because now, traditionally, we have now seen there's a shift in terms of transport management. And there's a good reason for that. Because in the past couple of decades, what we've seen is that urban mobility has changed from an old traditional system to a more dynamic technology enabled one. And the reason why that is because that transition has only accelerated to a point in time where we find ourselves in a very critical And that moment has transcended not just only in the kinds of devices that you use, but in all sorts of transportation. So whether or not you drive, whether you don't drive, whether you use a bus or a ferry, no matter which kind of transport mode that you're using, we now have technologies, for better or worse, which are now changing the way they move around. And that's where geofencing comes in, because it is now quickly proving itself to be situated at the heart of that change. It changes the whole entire dynamics, and it is a technology that is already here, and it is something that perhaps many people have not fully understood, but its presence is very much prevalent. So with that background in mind, I wanted to focus today is to capture the most essential bits on what geofencing is, how it works, and how does it really make cities a lot more safer, more sustainable, and a lot more better connected. So as I mentioned, this technology is advancing rapidly, but I do want to emphasize the fact that context matters a lot. And of course, there are some basic concepts that are still very much valid and they can be tailored to many cities. And geofencing is the kind of technologies that can be tailored to any city around the world. So I will be showing you today how geofencing is used in the case of Brisbane, so that by the end of it, you can see some of the lessons that the city learned and how its application led to the city becoming a lot more effective in terms of managing transport and how it enabled a transformation in a much more practical, actionable, and even meaningful ways, for the lack of another word. So Brisbane, in the past few years, has gone through a mobility revolution. And ever since its first scooter that was introduced back in 2018, the city has seen a exponential rise in its usage. To a point in time that there are now more than 4 million users across its e-scooter, across its transport network. And e-scooters sort of make up a bulk of that. That includes e-bikes, but also other mobility devices. But that what that really shows is how this technology has changed the way people move about in that city, and that calls for that city to change the way we build our infrastructure. And so with that regard, that what we've seen based on data is that there are changes in how commuters behave over time. And that change, what you see on this graph right here, is that there are certain fluctuations peaking at certain moments because of work commute requirements and events taking place, or some maybe seasonal travel shifts or something like that. But basically, what that means is that Brisbane is a very high volume, short to medium term length trip location, which basically means that there's a shift that can take place between mobility devices and the cars that are traditionally used to get to those areas. So in this diagram, you see these darker purple lines. They indicate a higher density of vehicle trips. And most of them are, as you can see, concentrated in the central business district. Some of it you can see on the southern bit of it, with an area called South Brisbane. And some of it is also towards the north, which is an area referred to as the Fortitude Valley. And the lighter lines suggest that there are sort of these traffic and mobility occurring on those locations, but not as that intensity. And we'll get to that moment why, explaining why that is. But if we do focus on the central bits, we'll notice that with any fast-growing sort of innovation, um, these are the sort of areas which are noticing a lot more challenges. And despite the large population, there is still a quite significant number of private vehicle dependency in this area. And for that reason, e-mobility sort of provides a solution in that regard because it helps reduce the use of private cars, particularly for these short distances, because people just need to travel within that city as opposed to going from point A to point B somewhere farther away. So if we are able to reduce the risk of operational inefficiencies, then that means that our solution towards providing better e-mobility is working well in that regard. What we've also noticed is that there are now more number of people using those scooters at every single day. So at some point in time, it started with about around 1,000 to 2,000 e-scooters per day, and that number has quadrupled to now even upwards of 6,000 vehicles per day in that area alone. And that steady, not even steady, but that exponential rise really is showing that visitors are now more comfortable with using this as an alternative means to getting around. And that only means that we need to provide better infrastructure and better regulation and better enforcement. And by every metric that we look and measure the city's sort of traffic patterns, we notice that the most busiest centers are the ones where the streets are narrower, where people can only access those places because they need to get to those areas without having the need to worry about parking, without having to worry about the need for accessibility or taking a longer route just to get from point A to point B. So for the case of Brisbane, we then worked on defining what geofencing really is. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a fairly advanced digital technology, but in a nutshell, it's all it really is. It's a establishment of a virtual boundary, and it uses GPS, radio frequencies, or internet systems to build that virtual boundary. And the idea is that within those boundaries, specific actions, whether they are about controlling speed, about accessing, restricting some sort of an access, or even regulating some parking rules, these are automatically triggered when a device or any vehicle enters or exits that zone. And the second component of that is how it operates within the broader transport ecosystem. So for this geofencing to work, we need stakeholders to work together. And in this case, we have divided the stakeholders into three major groups. We have the local government and the transport administration. They provide the sort of the policies and they manage them more dynamically. So they adjust the restrictions based on traffic density, based on any events that are taking place in that city, or any sort of larger, broader city goals about how do they want to manage the environment. That information is then forwarded to a data interchange, and the service providers, and these are the third-party operators. So think of Uber, think of Lime scooters, Beam, Neuron, all of these sort of private operators. They integrate a lot of these data into their platforms, and their primary function is to ensure that they comply with those regulations, and then they extend that information and build a geofenced so that the users who are signed up for that platform use it, and then they can sort of move about in that location. So in order to simplify this sort of technical sort of way of how this thing operates, what I thought of doing today was to show you how it works in a city's landscape. So here's an example of Brisbane's central business district. And think of geofencing as more like geoframing. And the way it works is that you operate that geoframe in real time. So if the city operators, the city planners, they would use those software platforms to define and map some geofenced areas on that location. And those sort of the parameters based on why they're choosing to earmark those specific locations could range anywhere from safety needs to congestion levels, or even sometimes if there's an event taking place, they may mark out where that event really is. Then what would happen is that different rules would be applied to those specific zones. So there could be speed limit zones. You could specify that e-scooters cannot exceed more than 10 kilometers, for example, in that one particular area. You could say that certain zones are no-go zones, that they're not allowed to be there entirely. Then you could also enforce some parking rules and say at what point these scooters can start their parking meters, at what time they need to end. And these can change dynamically, is what the intention is. So when any device, e-scooter, e-bike, or any vehicle for that matter, even trucks, for instance, these vehicles are equipped with a lot of these GPS and IoT chips. So chances are, if you have a car or any device that you bought after the year 2010, chances are it will already be sort of embedded with that system. So even if you use it or not, it's already there. But in any case, these devices constantly send and receive real life location data, and they translate that information and upload that so that these platforms can read and detect where those devices are at any given time. So as they approach those locations, the speed or any of the rules which were specified for that geofence area are now applied to that mobility device. So its onboard system receives that real-time command and then automatically adjusts its behavior to comply with those designated rules. In certain cases, riders might be notified of those speed changes, whether they are parking changes or any sort of rules that were specified for that area. The user would be notified of that. And in certain cases, they might be required to dismount or walk with their device. So in a nutshell, that's what geofencing really does. So how did Brisbane sort of really take advantage of this technology, and what are some of the things that they were really concerned about? Well, with the introduction of all these e-mobility devices that were coming on board, and because they were coming at some rapid changes, they created opportunity as well as a lot of challenges. And the biggest challenges that Brisbane was facing was in terms of safety. And with safety, the number one is speed-related accidents that occur. There were times when scooters would be sort of riding on footpaths at 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 60 kilometers an hour. So what would happen, do you think, is when a scooter would collide with another pedestrian hitting at 60 kilometers an hour? That would create a huge problem and a huge health concern. So, and this was happening quite a lot. So speed-related accidents were a number one safety concern that Brisbane City Council wanted to address. Similarly, safety not just for those who are, outside these scooters, the ones who are not using it, but also the ones who are using it. So there were users who were riding that 60 kilometers an hour and not wearing helmets, or they were doubling up. So two people on one scooter. And it turned out that there were a lot of injuries that were taking place because of just one single thing, that people were not wearing helmets. Similarly, there were issues about footpath congestion. People were leaving these scooters haphazardly. So sometimes they would sort of fall over on the main road. Sometimes they would just clutter the footpath. That would create a lot of accessibility barriers and so on and so forth. So that sort of becomes a big issue. But largely, it also talked a little bit about the first and the last mile gap. So people were using the devices. They would leave their home, use it, get onto the train station, and then get onto that device again and move on to the next one. And during that time, it turned out that the distance that they were covering was only 4 kilometers. So we needed something more sustainable for that. And finally, we had to create some incentivized green zones in order to encourage better and more pragmatic use of these devices, so that they can also then integrate more seamlessly with the transit developments. So just to give you an illustration of how that worked, is what geofencing does is that it looks at these traditionally static regulations like speed limits, which only specified how people would move about at certain times. And what it would do is that in these specific locations where there are lots of traffic conditions taking place, you have roads intersecting, you have interchanges, you have vehicles turning, one-way signs, no-go zones, all sorts of stuff. That enforcement basically becomes a huge challenge. So here comes geofencing, and what it does is that it earmarks and specifies those slow zones, so those devices automatically now have to comply with those rules, and there is no longer a need for manual need for you to charge a fine, because the device would stop working the moment they enter that restricted zone, or the moment they enter that low speed zone. The device itself will not enable them to go at 60 kilometers. It will limit their speed to 10 kilometers, for instance. On the front end, what the user will see is something like this on their device. So it will just indicate to them that this is these areas where they're not allowed to go, or these are the areas where they are allowed to go. And that also extended towards parking. So traditionally, you would have these parking signs that would tell you whether or not you can park them. And if we were doing this sort of seminar in person, I would sort of ask you, by show of hands, if you can tell me whether you can park in this street at this particular time. And I kid you not, there are signs like this all over Brisbane that sort of are just inundated with so many rules, and it's hard to tell whether or not you can park there or not. So geofencing, what that does is that it allows that software to specify locations where people can actually park. And then depending on different um, times of the day, you can change the value of the rate at which the parking is allowed. And you can also specify whether or not you can park in those areas. And the user, what they would see is that in that app, they will just click on that particular zone and it will take care of all the rest. It will tell you whether or not you can park there, how much parking will be charged in that particular area, and you don't have to pay any more than you need to while you are there. And for e-mobility devices, these devices will have these earmarked zones, and they will only stop working when you park them in those designated zones. So otherwise, if you leave them anywhere outside that zone, the meter will continue to run. So this is done so that it encourages the user to comply with those rules. And the moment they park their bike at the right place, they can disconnect and they don't need to pay for that parking meter any longer. And finally, some other example about rerouting, because this happens a lot for e-mobility. There are events that take place, road constructions and the like. So you need to create situations in which there are changes in frequency in bus routes. And so if there's a way to notify the user or that there are any bus changes that are happening, you can just do so through that software. You can specify where that bus is and you can track it. And the user, what they would see is something like this on their app, that there's a bus that is about 2 minutes away. And if it's delayed, it will also notify you. And so, people would no longer be impatient waiting for that bus. They would know exactly when that next bus is arriving. And this is all done at the back end from a geofencing technology. And same applies if you're wanting to get a scooter, you can also then sort of look at that app and it will tell you exactly where that scooter is. And this is done at the back end using geofencing technology. And I will conclude with just 3 lessons that we have seen from Brisbane's point of view and why implementation matters so much when it comes to geofencing. The number one thing is that geofencing, like any other technology, depends a lot on collaborative governance. And what that means is that there needs to be a shared vision between governments, private operators, and the communities so that they can all work together in order to align with the city's priorities. So in the case of Brisbane, when they wanted to make the city a lot more safer, it was these different stakeholders coming together and agreeing that they needed to create a system that benefited everyone. The second lesson that we've learned in Brisbane's case is leveraging advanced technology. So while new devices are coming on board and they will continue to do so, but what matters is that any technology is the backbone of, of, of a city. And particularly in the case of geofencing, that is very much important because now with AI technologies, we can now adjust in real time without having to manually put the data metrics onto that platform. AI can do that work for us and specify based on the need and congestion uh, demands. It can reroute different devices based on wherever they're needed at different times of the day. And finally, the biggest lesson is the public engagement. Nothing works unless the people trust that system. And in case of Brisbane, the user trust was a critical factor in making geofencing really work. So what Brisbane City Council did was to encourage a lot more public seminars and education just to explain how geofencing really works and what the benefits are and why it matters to comply with those rules. And once these 3 things work together, it worked very well. So I think in a just a brief demonstration of how geofencing is like, I just want to leave you with one final thought, and that is that planning and execution of any technology is needed, especially in the case of geofencing, because for any city to work and make any public space work optimally, we need to expand in such a manner that adapts to changes, not only just becomes as a stronghold and using systems which are archaic in nature. So because the future is more adaptive and geofencing allows that adaptation to take place in order to address a lot of challenges that cities will currently face and are going to be facing in the future. Hopefully this was helpful. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Dr. Mubeen, for your insightful presentation. Very interesting to see how to enhance and promote the use of e-mobility by leveraging technology through geofencing. So I found it very interesting. So thank you for that. We're going to move on to some questions. I also have a question. So I think obviously you've mentioned geofencing allows for the collection of valuable data and vehicle movements and travel usage and patterns. How can this be used to optimize charging infrastructure or how we plan and design for charging infrastructure with regards to electric vehicle charging infrastructure, plan new routes and basically improve overall urban mobility?
Yeah, that's a big question and an important one. In terms of charging infrastructure, geofencing, what that allows is it it builds a system where you can ensure reliability, efficiency, and widespread adoption. The best example I can give in terms of charging infrastructure would be looking at high demand zones. So especially like transit hubs, for instance. Uh, as more and more people use these areas, we want to encourage people to come to those locations and use them. So if they're coming from home and they move to a bus stop or any major transit station, we want to create a seamless integration between the two. So if they use an app and that e-mobility device allows them to start that journey there, and then it tells them that the moment they enter that new train line, for instance, whatever they're being charged is automatically transferred to the next zone. So that incentivizes the that simplifies the system entirely. So you don't need two different um, sort of tickets just to get onto that system. You can just use one platform to do so. And if you're using one platform, you're creating greater efficiency. That means the rates themselves are coming down as well. So that's the soft side of, I would say, congestion charging. The other is the docks themselves. So what you're talking about is looking at the first and the last mile connectivity. So I would extend that towards not just the train station, but also any sort of park and ride facilities where those spaces can need um, these charging options. And so those docks can allow users to and plug that device in, and it will charge for them. And the moment then they come back to it, it's all used. So it sort of, and you just want to create more. You will just want to be able to enable that more and more in all of these places, and the more that you have it in different locations, it will work that much more seamless.
Thank you. We have another question. Um, the question is from Rebecca. Um, I understand how the geofencing works for rideshare e-bikes and scooters with mobile applications, but is it possible to apply to private scooters or e-bikes, or do those need to be controlled through more traditional speed enforcement measures?
Private scooters, as in like people who are using it, not like through third-party applications. That I would
Y-
mean.
Yes, I think it would be a private scooter, maybe that someone owns themselves, which is not sort of linked to the uh, to the some of the examples that you showed, where you have an e-scooter and you've got to park it in a specific location because obviously it's a yeah, a ride share system. So if it's a private scooter, um, how do these need to be controlled through traditional speed enforcement measures? How would that be controlled?
Well, I can think of these private scooters like Segway, Ninebots, Yami, these kind of e-scooters. They, from a manufacturer standpoint, they come with these built-in GPS tracking and geofencing capabilities. They're already embedded in them, and they only operate, you know, uh, in the locations where geofence zones are already earmarked. So the moment they enter those zones, um, the the onboard system there would automatically read that regulation and then comply with it. So that's the embedded ones. But there are people who are they tend to tweak those things as well. So they tinker with the settings sometimes. So from that point of view, governments sort of come in and they provide some software updates and they sort of mandate them. And so they require those manufacturers to update those particular softwares on those devices that are already sort of released and sort of sold to the public. But this basically requires a lot more collaboration between the government and the manufacturer, and the need to sort of push those firmware updates across. There's a good example of that in Europe, basically. So Copenhagen does that very well. They require certain speed caps in certain areas for all scooter models, regardless of uh, whichever produced them. And so that's one way. And if I recall correctly, they use the smart lock system. So it's an internet system that just works with those geofence zones. So it disables those scooters from operating directly in those certain areas. And those scooters will only operate if they are connected to that internet at that time. So that's the other way. Yeah, I think so. In a nutshell, it's these are some of the mechanisms by which they can control speed in that regard, and not just speed, by the way, just for other things as well, in terms of how these devices opt in for them. In case of Brisbane, just to conclude, uh, there there was a case in which the third-party operator Beam was sort of not using the right metrics, so they were not complying with those regulations, and then the government sort of stepped in and imposed a lot of fines to them. So that's an example of how governments and private sector need to sort of collaborate more and more, and it's going to happen because that's the that's the only way it will work.
Thank you. I think, yeah, that answers that question. We have another question. This is from Lloyd. Lloyd, right? What happens when GPS connectivity is temporarily lost? Does the vehicle have a default setting that it reverts to? So, yeah, what happens when GPS connectivity is temporarily lost? And does the vehicle have a default setting that it reverts to?
Yeah, previously that was a problem, but no longer. So it does have a so the information is already now embedded in that device. So it doesn't necessarily need to detect entry or exit. It detects it ahead of time, is what I'm saying. So it operates on a safe mode, for instance. So when a GPS signal is lost, that device will operate in a safe mode. And that safe mode is basically something like, it cannot exceed more than 10 kilometers an hour, something like that. Or if there are sometimes disrupted communication with any cloud server, because that's not a user fault, for instance. It's maybe a third party thing that they lose connectivity in that regard because of some central database loss. Again, that is sort of filled in by those data updates that are provided to, to those devices. So any sort of tracking failure that might occur is sort of taken care of by switching over to that safe mode, and that's one. And then finally, they could also do any last location. So if the device is moving from one zone to another zone, and let's say you were driving at 25 kilometers an hour, and you just happen to reach the next zone, and right at that moment, the GPS signal was lost. So what that would do is that it would look at the positioning from the cellular data uh, uh, towers, and then it will sort of track you that way, and then ensure that it is now again reverted to a safe mode. So, but traditionally that was a problem, but no longer. That has sort of it's a problem that's now obsolete. So there's very little um, chances that even if the data is lost, the device will now switch over to safe mode. It's really hard to change that.
Thank you. So I think that concludes I see we have, is it one? Yes, we have another
Ada,
question. Sorry,
sorry,
yes, go
Ada,
on, Johanna.
just wanted to chip in. There's a question by Manuel also in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I will go through Nouriel has posed a question first, and I'll come back to Manuel. Thank you. So Nouriel has asked, which agencies pay for the rollout and maintenance of the geofencing system? Are there open data policies in place covering the use of geofencing data in Brisbane?
I'm sorry, you were cutting off. Which agencies behave?
Which agencies pay for the rollout and maintenance of geofencing system? Are there open data policies in place covering the use of geofencing data in Brisbane?
Okay. Um, yeah, there are many providers for uh, now they're third party. Sort of these are open source, so you can pretty much create your own geofence, really. For security reasons, I could not show what the government is using, which platform for hacking and stuff like that. But a lot of the, for example, the ride-hailing firms, Uber, Lyft, Didi, sort of they use their own systems to sort of regulate deliveries and curb space regulations. But a lot of these systems are now open source, and you can create your own. And geofencing has recently sort of been translated for the transport side of it, but previously it was used for advertisements, marketing, and sort of tracking location for of users. So, when imagine you're walking down the street and you start getting notification for a specific ad, and that happens because you just entered a geofence zone for a particular shop, and so they would know that you have now entered their area, and they would now provide you with advertisements for their products. So that's the kind of rollout software that people are using, uh, and so that's that. And I think the second bit of the question was about the revenue sharing. Is that if I understood correctly?
Are there open data policies in place covering the use of geofencing data in Brisbane?
In Brisbane,
Yeah. So looking at open data policies covering the use of geofencing data. So yeah.
I wouldn't be too sure about that. I think some data is publicly available, and I think if I'm not mistaken, you need to apply to the council and ask request for that data for research purposes or for many other reasons. If there's some sensitive data that is required, but majority of times these data are already collected by these third-party applications, and so you need to. So every time you say I agree to these platforms, they're collecting data. So you need to reach out to them. All that collection is in your hands, but you need to specify what is that you're allowed to share. Um, but the majority of times that data is being collected on its own. So
Thank you. We have another question, and this is from Manuel. Thanks for the enlightened presentation, Dr. Ahmed. Do private operators have any kind of concerns on the obligation of sharing the data? And regarding the collaborative governance, what kind of committees or institutional arrangements are in place to make geofencing work?
Yeah, this is our part two question. For geofencing, it's a very broad one, but it's an important one, certainly. But the short answer is yes, mobility operators, they do comply. And I think I would say number one thing is for privacy and user data protection. Concern is that there's some real-time data, you know, that data is sort of used for the real-time purposes. So that's one. I think it's sort of it's generally protected under the General Data Protection Regulation. And in case of Brisbane, there's an Australia Privacy Act. So that sort of requires companies to ensure that the user's data is made anonymous before it is shared with that third party. And that's I agree that one. But there have been cases where Uber specifically and even Didi have sort of resisted the government's demands to and they really wanted detailed trip data. And so that's one. And the way the government sort of addressed that as a problem was to request and make it a bit more aggregated data instead of individualized trip details. So that sort of helped ensure a bit more user privacy in that regard. But in terms of security breach and risk of misuse, yeah, I mean, that's always a concern. There is always, lack of cybersecurity measures. But this is ongoing, it's an ongoing thing. Didi was investigated at some point because they had a bit of a data security risk, and it was being misused. But then it was quickly sort of enforced to use encryption standards to improve them, so that that data remains protected. And for that reason, the answer to the previous question also is sort of tied with this one, because a lot of the blockchain data verification is what is now currently being used. So therefore, it's hard to get that data, specific one. So you need um, you, you want to be able to not compromise on user privacy. So you want to ensure that the regulatory uncertainty that happens um, is is eliminated through clear and consistent sort of policies. And again, it comes back down to collaboration between governments and the stakeholders. So and that's why Brisbane's case showcases that collaboration between different stakeholders is absolutely essential in things like this to work together. Otherwise, there are going to be legal actions.
Thank you. I believe we've covered all the questions. Are there any other last-minute questions from anyone? Okay. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today, and a special thanks to Professor Mubeen for that very insightful presentation and a response to the questions. Like I said previously, we will share the recording with all registered participants as soon as possible. We hope to see you in our next webinar with Justin Cross on decarbonization in the maritime sector, which we will be holding in the next few weeks on the 5th of March. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.